I'll never get a tattoo from a robot because I like human error.
This is Josh's newest release, Model Citizen. It's a memoir. Dude, you just kind of went full frontal in this one.
That's my zero fucks book right there, Craig.
For some reason, I had it in my head that you had another memoir under your belt. Am I totally wrong about that?
I published a memoir about 4 years ago called Sirens, the first half of Model Citizen. So what happened is that in my 30s, I started to have these series of strokes. Then I had 3 strokes. And when I had the third one, they figured out that I was born missing an entire wall in my heart. They were going to go in my heart and they were going to build a wall, which was like this cool thing I didn't know that they could do. And they did that. Spoiler alert, I totally survived the heart surgery. I don't want anyone worried. I had been off needles for about 7 years when I had the surgery. And in order to have the surgery, I had to get high on opiates. So it became this interesting existential exercise. And then all of a sudden, in order to save my life, I had to risk my life. And all of these things that I'd worked so hard to kind of rebuild a life that I had completely dismantled, I was finally figuring out how to do right by myself. And then suddenly following the doctor's orders, I'm supposed to put a needle in my arm. So I think as most people would, that like the end of the story was I had the heart surgery and I didn't relapse, I mean, that was the end. That wasn't the end. And then about 2 years after that surgery, I had another stroke. And that one was really serious too. Like my arm didn't work for a few days and I couldn't really talk. And now they don't have any idea what's going on. Having that fourth stroke, once they told me I was fixed, became kind of this perfect vehicle to talk about addiction or to talk about relapse. In that, you go to rehab, everyone wants to believe that everything's fine now. But of course, if you really think about it, we all know that that's a farce. The joke I've been sort of making around this book is I thought the story was over, probably the same way Aaron Sorkin thought the story was over when he wrote his Facebook movie. But don't you think if his Facebook movie came out after the Trump years, it probably would have had a different ending, right? Kind of became the gasoline, to see like, what do I want to explore in this new one? It was this idea, this concept around if somebody tells you you're fixed, what do you do with that bit of information? Because I would argue that in one way or another, as human beings, we're all unrepairable. For me, it's drugs, right? But for somebody else, it's gambling or it's food or it's sex. So I didn't want it to just be an addiction memoir, right? I was thinking about it more as a relapse memoir, which you might think is splitting hairs. But to me, I think that's really important, right? Because I would argue that anybody can get clean. But the idea of staying clean and do right by yourself day after day, that's the difficult part of it. So I wanted to write this book in such a way that I was putting the reader inside my set of perceptions. So you could have, 300 pages to test drive what might be going on for a parent that you love who struggles with booze or drugs, or a sibling or a child or a friend. So you can kind of use my visceral language on the line level to mimic the way an addict's brain works. So the reader has the opportunity to inhabit that. And hopefully that elicits a little bit more empathy.
A good half of the book is not about addiction. It's about you grappling with temptation, which I think you did really, really well.
The addiction memoir is well-trampled territory, right? Yeah. Where someone's going to tell you like a bunch of war stories and then like, that's it. It's a binary. I was dirty and now I'm clean. With this book, what I'm saying is that's bullshit. There is no binary here. And if you think you're a binary, then you haven't struggled this way. We're always going to be dealing with these sirens singing. Like we're always going to hear those temptations. We're always going to hear those things. The question then becomes like, are you going to act on it? The terrifying thing about relapse isn't that you might go out, but what scares me about it is the idea that it doesn't need a trigger. I would understand if like I got fired or there was a diagnosis or something like that, but oftentimes it's just Tuesday. And it's the Tuesday of it all that is so petrifying, right?
I volunteered at the Needle Exchange in San Francisco for a couple of years, and the guy running the training was kind of polling everybody. So why do people do drugs? You're hearing all the usual emotional this or that and the triggers and everything. And one guy, one of the staff people, a recovering addict, just shouts out, "It's fun." And no one ever says that. There's sometimes no profound existential thing.
Booze and drugs helped me for a really long time. Like, it helped me stop thinking about things that I was not ready to deal with yet. But then when I wanted to be in charge, at that point, I didn't have any agency left. They were sitting in the driver's seat, and I was not anymore. But no one ever says that for a while, it was this helpful presence. I wanted to kind of imbue that side of the argument in the book too. Like, I know that there are some writers here. I hope that there are some writers here. And, one of the things
they're all writers here. And that's
kind of using as the North Star as I was writing this book was the philosophy of like, write what you know. I don't have any problem with that, but I want to add a phrase to the end of it. Like, write what you know, but never write what you understand. I don't ever want to seem as though I'm an expert on anything, because there's no curiosity there. I want to write into the moral mud. I want to write into the very confusing enterprise of simply being alive. The fact that I don't know the answers to most of the questions the book is asking, I would argue that that's the book's job, is just to pose the questions. And then every audience member for herself gets to populate her own organic answers.
A good chunk of what you just said makes this hour worth it already. I've had enough arguments. I've lost enough arguments with significant others, close friends, flatmates, to know how often my recollection is completely wrong about something. It's common knowledge that eyewitness testimony is the weakest evidence in court. So how do you square that with your recollections that are going to be flawed as a baseline with a memoir, and then you factor in being inebriated? So how do you structure a memoir with that in mind?
It's something that's always going to come up, like whether you're talking about an addiction memoir or a weight loss memoir. It doesn't matter, because memory is so fallible. Neuroscience would say that every time you revisit a memory, you change it just a little bit. Right. So then if you've revisited this memory, 10, 500, 1,000 times, you're playing a game of telephone with yourself. So who knows how kind of extraordinarily stretched out and contorted the funhouse mirror is going to look. I think the North Star for the memoirist is trying to be emotionally true and trying to search for kind of the verisimilitude within your story. For example, the question for most memoirists isn't necessarily about content. Most memoirists know their own content if they remember their lives. It's more a matter of how the hell do you structure a memoir? Because I have access, say if you're 40 years old, I'm 44, we use my age. So I have 44 years to choose from, but I didn't want to write an autobiography, which would be everything, right? I wanted to zero in on a certain epoch. Like, how do you find structure in something as formless as reality? And I would argue that architecture is the hardest thing for memoirists to nail. And for those of you who are writing a memoir right now, I would also like to say that structure in memoir composition is almost always the last thing to reveal itself. So if you're kind of banging your head against your memoir wall and you're not figuring out how to quite put all the tiles in the mosaic properly together, don't worry about it. You're doing all the right stuff. Like, keep showing up, keep honoring the book. I heartily believe that the book will whisper its secrets to you. You just have to give it enough time. Like, I always tell clients or graduate students that the one thing we know about art is it will never be efficient, right? Like, you're never going to write your book as fast as you want to write your book. And your book doesn't care that your New Year's resolution was to finish the book by March 1st. Like, that doesn't mean anything to the book. As long as we keep an open ears and we keep an open heart, the book will tell us. But we do need to have some sort of fundamental organizing principle. What I do in Memoir Town is I always think about it in terms of being an amateur astronomer. So think about this fist, right, as being like a planet in a planetary system. And the planet then is what's supplying the gravity. And then once we have a gravitational force, that allows the moons then to satellite around the planet. So why is that helpful for a memoirist? we need to figure out what the planet's going to be. And it has to be something of a short duration of time, whether that's 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. That's going to be different from memoir to memoir. In my life, what I structured this book around, I had my third stroke on January 1st, 2015, and my heart surgery was scheduled for March 11th of that year. So I had this 2-month window. That's basically the present action of the first half of the book. It only covers 2 months. That's the planet. We're always returning to that planet, but we're also hopping in our time machine. And we're going to hit this moon in 1989, and this moon in 1991, and this moon in 2003, this one way back in 1978. But we're always returning to something that the reader recognizes, and it's accruing velocity, meaning, and emotional resonance every time we come back to. Figuring out what that through line is going to be in your story is great, because right now you probably just have a bunch of stuff that's like just kind of chronologically told. And that's fine for you to write that way, but typically that's not the most exciting way for the end reader to interact with it. Write in a more causal way so then you can see kind of the relationships between the beats of your life that you're trying to honor on the page. That's your part of the job. But then later, you would want to be a little bit more nimble and a little bit more limber with how you're approaching structure to figure out what's going to be the most exciting vehicle for the reader to come up on board and understand the story. So it's just something for you to think about this week as you're like thinking about your your memoir, the essay that you might be writing, what's supplying the gravity for me? And then what's cool about that, once you know that, it will really help you in the revision process, because then that's how the moons are going to earn their space. If they're not speaking directly to what the planet is concerned about, you got to cut that moon, right? And certain planets are going to need 23 moons and certain planets need 1. Your book will have its own idiosyncrasies and nuances. I'm just trying to make a suggestion about how you curate life experience, our own life experience, because we feel like everything needs to be there. And the end reader does not feel the same way.
I noticed you also had this really nice parody between the present events and your backstory. So you would always have the Freelaps, you call it, where the doctor says you have to take the anesthesia to do this surgery. You would pair that with something from your past. So as you're taking the anesthesia, then you cut to a scene in a bathroom doing whatever, right? You would always kind of pair these things, having this sort of dark and light side of the moon, present day action, passed out on the floor with numbness from the stroke, and then midstream you cut to overdosing. And I'm skimming through my memory here. Am I making any sense at all? That's usually the question I open with.
I think you're making sense. Yeah, and I think, I would say that every chapter in Model Citizen is comprised of 2 threads. There's always a story happening in the present tense, and there's always a story happening in the past tense. And the reason I chose that model is it allowed me to create kind of these vibrant juxtapositions, or put things in conversation that might not readily seem like they go together. So for example, like what you're talking about, when you see me going on the operating table, right, and you see the anesthesiologist, running the fentanyl in the artery in my wrist, I'm cutting that with when I get out of rehab. So you're seeing that I've worked so hard to rebuild this life, right? I'm finally just about to get my shit together. And now, because you're so seeing that in such close proximity, it adds another tendril of heat to the story. So to go back to what I was saying earlier about causality and chronological or linear storytelling, remember, plot isn't just content. Plot is equal parts content and structure. So I could have had that rehab scene on page 75, and I could have had the moment on the operating table on page 189. But then I risk the idea that they might not be in conversation for you. And if I choose to tell those riffs with this element of simultaneity, what I'm hoping is it makes you uncomfortable. What I'm trying to do is make the reader as complicit in the action as she can possibly be. The best definition of the word visceral I ever heard, Craig, is from a writer named Charlie Baxter, who says what visceral really means is that you're sitting in the front row of a playhouse, and the actors are so into the production that their spit is hitting you in the face. I always think about it in my work, like probably in a rough draft, she's sitting in row 30, if I'm lucky. In every draft, I'm trying to get her closer and closer to the stage until she's sitting in row 1 and she can feel kind of the actor's spit hitting her skin.
I was going to ask about structure as well, and I like the metaphor you used, the gravitational pull. Like, what's the central pull and what's orbiting?
What's cool about the structure of the book is the book is all over the place and it's doing all these things that in memoir you're not allowed to do. Like there's all this surrealism, like I'm talking to a dog and I'm talking to a Nazi doctor, the guy who invented the surgery. This is actually really interesting. So the guy who invented the surgery I had in the 1920s was this young German doctor. I mean, he posited that he could run a catheter into the human heart and he couldn't get any funding. Nobody wanted to give him any money. And because he's German, he thought to himself, I'll just do it to myself. He cut himself on the elbow crease. And Craig, he ran a urinary catheter all the way up into his heart. And then he had to walk 2 flights of stairs, the baller, to get to the x-ray room. So there was proof. He did this as he was a kid. And in that one moment, like he changed the world, valve repairs, angioplasty. That's an amazing thing. He saved millions of lives. And then 10 years later, he's patching up Nazi soldiers on the Russian front. So it begs the question, is that a good life? Is that a bad life? Or is that the wrong thing to be asking in the first place? And so because he was the one who created the surgery, and he had, as you've been saying, kind of the light and the dark side of the moon, he became a perfect catalyst for me to have some dialogue with back and forth as I'm grappling with my own good and bad as I'm kind of coming of age in the scope of the story.
The Nazi doctor is great. That makes sense. But then you've got your duffel bag. The duffel bag you named Josephine, literally putting up with your dirty laundry. And then you've got the dog, who is lovely, but didn't cut you any slack. So how did you land on those two particular devices as far as storytelling?
I think a memoir should reflect 2 things, probably a lot more, but let's just start with 2. It should sound like the way that person talks, right? So like the joke I like to use around this, like you either use the word lugubrious in casual conversation or you don't. Once they get to the computer, they get self-conscious and all of a sudden they want to talk this like thesaurus Wikipedia person. And it's so dry and it's so boring. A memoir should sound like the person is sitting on the bar stool next to you, whispering this story in your ear. Like I really feel like it needs to be that intimate. And if you can't hear it that closely, then there's still work to be done on that draft. The book's not ready to go out the door yet. So you want to figure out how it sounds on the line level like you talk. The other thing about it, and this relates to your question, Craig, is I think the mind of the book should be indicative of how that person sees the world. And like I have a very hallucinatory imagination, and I wanted to bring that and honor that in the book too. Like second half of the book, like we get this dumb Subaru Outback, right, which is like the most suburban dad car I could possibly have, and I'll drop my kid off at daycare, and then I start to have conversations with the Subaru Outback. He's like, are you really going to go out? Are you really going to mess this up? Your life is so perfect right now. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? And it's just a manifestation of the conversations I would be having anyways. So rather than telling it just a straight thought process, which can seem sort of dry on the page, you can kind of use a device like this to bring in a little bit more emblematic life, to up the readability factor, to lure the audience just a little bit closer, because she says to herself, I haven't seen it like this before. Like we're all telling the same story. So it's really never about the what. It's more kind of about the why, and I would argue how. How you're telling the story, that's style, that's aesthetic. That's the version of you that you're putting on the page. Like, I really believe, I know this is going to sound like Dreamcatcher California, so forgive me if this offends anybody.
It's okay.
Like, I believe this is a conch shell. And I believe that if I've done my job right, you can hold it up to your ear and you can hear my heartbeat. The artifact becomes this way that you and I get to be friends. This woman I'll never meet in Detroit, this guy I'll never know from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, when they're in the book for that 6 hours, 7 hours, like, we're thick as thieves. I mean, that's what I love as an artist, but it's also what I love as a reader. And we're always trying to write the book that we want to read.
So when I'm reading, I'm looking for the writer's signature. I am looking for the thing that they are doing with the basics that everybody knows, that they take in some direction that they do really well. I couldn't find it with yours at first. It took me a minute, but halfway through, I figured out what you were doing.
Ooh, I want to hear. What am I doing?
I'm on to you. Here's the strings and pulleys behind everything. What I noticed you did to great effect was there's sort of a slow pulsing to your sentence length and paragraph length, which is a basic thing at some level. Thriller writers will make shorter sections as the action paces more quickly. But in your case, it's much more subtle and harder to pinpoint, but there are times when you get down to these single short staccato sentences that are really intimate. You say something like, if you hold this book to your ear, does it hiss? And then the times when you are spiraling, either relapsing or struggling with the temptation, and you do these long run-on sentences that are much more difficult than people realize. You've got paragraphs in here that are pages long. You've got sentences in here that are entire pages. And altogether, it's the current of a river that follows the structure of the story, and you do it beautifully.
Thank you for making that observation. I love that. On one hand, like, I feel like one of the most underutilized weapons, for lack of a better word, that we have as writers is contrast. Meaning that, like, nothing can be quiet if we don't know what loud sounds like. So I think in similar ways with sentence structure, like, I never want all of my sentences to sound the same. So it's more a matter of, I'll set the baseline. This is going to be kind of like what things sound like when all is well. And then we'll see things when we hit the accelerator this way, and we'll see things when we hit the accelerator in another way. Sometimes it's going to get fast, reckless, and relentless. And when I want it to sound like that, that's what I employ, what I like to call the grammar malfunction. When, like, things are going to get super, super, super sprawly, because I'm trying to make it the most claustrophobic sentence that it can possibly be. Typically, these are sentences that you probably want to find a way out of, but I'm not going to let you find that way out. Like, I'm going to keep you in this moment with me. I'm going to make sure that we're in that lockstep, or that kind of symbiosis happening between audience and main character on the page, where you're experiencing what I'm experiencing. I also read something that Faulkner had said that really resonated with me as a reader, where he said that, like, when he have a story build to a crescendo, he'll analyze the sentence structures at the beginning of the story when everything's fine. Say that he's starting it with longer sentences, that by the time he's getting near his apex or his climax, then he's going staccato, 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 or the other way around, that he would start the story with more kind of rules of the road, properly grammatical sentences, and by the time he got to the climax, we would be breaking all of the rules of grammar as well. So those are things that were in the back of my mind, certainly as I was thinking about what I wanted the book to sound like. But the other thing that I think is important for the memoirists out there is we're all looking for that marriage between form and content. And for me, because I've lived a very punk rock life, I wanted this book to sound like a punk rock song, like a Bad Brain song. I left mistakes in this book, Craig, that I would have not left in a novel. Like, if it was a novel, there are things that I would have cleaned up. But because I wanted it to sound like a Bad Brain song, what that means is the guitar's out of tune, right? And the singer's on coke, so he's speeding up and slowing down. It's the third week of the tour, so the singer's hoarse. I wanted there to be those mistakes on the page because it's emblematic of the lifestyle that I've lived. So I think anything that you can do to humanize and chisel out the memoir that only you can write. At the end of the day, the thing that you have that nobody else has is your specific imagination. Like nobody else on earth has an imagination. Let me just look at some names. Nobody else on earth has an imagination like Dana or like Chris or like another Chris or like Kathleen. So we want to be like as precisely and nuanced the version of like capital U us as we can possibly be. Sentence is the micro version of that. And then the form and content discussion of the Bad Brain song would be the more macro version of the same discussion.
It's like auto-tuning a singer where they're so perfect. What's the point of having that singer if you're going to take all the scratches and breaks out of their voice?
I like tattoos for the human ear. Pretty soon, I'm sure we can get tattoos from robots. I like tattoos because, they were worried about like a sick parent. And so like the line's a little blurry, right? Or they're like, we're hungry, so there's a blowout. And I find that to be very exciting, the mistakes that we make. Because ultimately, I think that style is a reflection of our very idiosyncratic way of seeing the world.
So the other thing you do, along with switching sentence length and paragraph length, it's point of view. Some of the most intimate and tender parts of your past, you switch to the third person. When you're playing underneath your mom while she's playing piano and you're at her feet messing with the pedals and she's laughing, that was just really sweet. So why were you holding that with tongs at arm's length? What drove that choice?
Some of it has to do with the preoccupation of that particular chapter. I'm in Reno and this woman gives me her baby. Like she's going to go score drugs and she hands me her baby. She doesn't know me at all. And she goes to cop for us and I'm here with this kid. And so I start to reflect on all the crazy men that my mom left me because she was an addict too. I'm always trying to paint my characters with the dignity of complexity. And it would be very easy for me to just be like, she was an addict, so she made a bunch of mistakes. In fact, I have that phrase taped up in my office, the dignity of complexity, because I want to not just give it to my primary players, I also want to give it to my tertiary ones as well. And in that chapter, I'm holding this addict's baby and I'm waiting to get coke and I'm thinking about all the men that my mom left me with. And I tell a story in that chapter about one of them burning my arm with a cigarette. I got to the end of writing that chapter and was like, this is so monochromatic. It was just so one note. I just wanted to factor into the fray that like my mom and I had a lot of happy memories too. And the thing that I think about the most, if you ask me what was happy about like our weird coming of age, it's me under her piano bench, listening to her play the piano. I loved being under there. And I'd start messing with her pedals and she would pretend that she didn't know who was doing it. And it was a moment of genuine joy. And that was so rare in our status quo. And so I wanted that to be the flavor left in the reader's mouth after having endured 10 pages of monochromatic gloom.
And I love that quote. I'll remember that. Even with the boyfriend or stepdad at whatever stage he was, the guy who burned your arm with a cigarette, you said very kind things about him as well. I mean, that was a barbaric thing to do to such a little kid, but you gave him more than just this super villain burning you with a cigar.
I'm glad that you brought that up because there's another thing of other memoirists here. Remember that there's always at least two versions of you in a memoir. There's the one of you who's enduring the beginning, middle, and an ending. But then there's a version of you that sits outside the scope of the story that we would call the retrospective narrator, who's looking back on these things. And the retrospective narrator has the capacity to offer certain asides, certain editorializations, or certain thoughts that you would not be able to have organic during a certain vignette. So, for example, if I'm a 10-year-old kid riding in Jim's truck, and he says he wants to burn my arm with a cigar, and he does it, the obvious thing the retrospective narrator would say is, and don't burn the children. They're the future. It's like little Whitney Houston's, right? Like, I don't think that the retrospective narrator should ever corroborate what the reader is witnessing. I would say that the job of the retrospective narrator is to complicate, not corroborate. So if the retrospective narrator is just going to say, you shouldn't burn the kids, that's not earning its space. But if the retrospective narrator tells the audience, hey, look, I liked being around Jim. You know why I liked being around Jim? Because he fucking showed up. And I spent so much time alone and so much time being ignored. I think the line in the book is, if you spend enough time being ignored, a burning cigar on your arm isn't so bad. And it brings an element of complexity to Jim's character. Otherwise, he would just seem like some paint by numbers villain. And how boring is that?
Nothing I can say in response that's going to be better than that particular summary and those particular slug lines.
If here's like, pretend this is Luke Skywalker over here, right? And here's Darth Vader over here. He's like kicking a dog. Luke Skywalker is helping her landlady with the trash. The poles of this spectrum of characterization are useless for us if we're interested in being literary writers. Right. When I say literary, I don't mean anything pretentious. I just mean character-driven. So if you're interested in character-driven writing, who cares about the poles? All of your characters need to be in the middle. In the middle allows your characters to be these like unctuous tangle of strengths and weaknesses. It allows them to be real. It allows us to see them from a multitude of vantage point, and no one's reduced to being a hero and no one's reduced to being a villain. That's boring. That's didactic storytelling. I just want to tell people a story about very flawed people, sometimes trying to do right by themselves and ultimately, often, not knowing how to get out of their own way.
About the editing process, having written both a novel and a memoir, what would you say kind of stood out as in the editing process?
Well, I would say that I was very happy to have a bunch of novels under my belt before I wrote a memoir. So I thought about structure like a novelist. And novelists are typically always using disjunctive or kind of nonlinear storytelling. For the memoirists, I think specifically, allow yourself to have too much. I think that all books have a natural target body weight. I'm 6'2". I need to be 180 pounds to look the way that I want to look. And I have a really good friend who's 6'2" as well, and he needs to be 230 pounds to look the way he wants to look. He's not a fat guy. You just have different size frames. And I think books work the same way. And really the only way to figure out what your book's target body weight is to see it a little bit too chubby, and then to see it a little bit too emaciated, and then to kind of zero in exactly what's going to kind of be the right length to bring that thing to life. So when I'm writing early drafts, the nascent drafts for me are kind of like 1 through 3. And I do all of that on the computer. That's when I'm overwriting. I'm just allowing myself to fill up this like vast reservoir of information. I'm not a curator yet. I'm not thinking about structure. I'm just getting it all down to see what has heat. Because Michael, I don't know if you've had this experience or not as a memoirist, but sometimes the sequences I think are totally going to kill on the page, I put them down, they just lie there useless. And other sequences that I think are just going to be connective tissue totally have charisma on the line level, and I'm going to be able to build a scene around those things too. So I try not to do too much troubleshooting in my head on the book's behalf. I like the book to tell me what's earning its space and what's not earning its space. I write it all down first. And then around draft 5, I switched to almost exclusively oral editing. I read this book out loud, I would say, at least 100 times. That's the only way I can catch the cadence stuff. I'm a failed musician, so I think in terms of time signature. It's the only way I can tell if I'm skipping beats. It's the only way I can tell if I'm consistently rendering the information the way I want to render the information. And once I start to edit out loud like that, it's really obvious to me what's dragging, what's boring, what's slowing the pace down. And I'm just merciless. Remember that your previous draft is saved in some digital safety deposit box. So that gives you permission to copy it over and intentionally break it. You know, like, what if chapter 4 is chapter 1? What if chapter 4 is chapter 10? And be as playful, be as promiscuous with the book as you possibly can. Because that's the only way to figure out what the right decisions are if you see what some of the wrong decisions on the book's behalf might be. So maybe try some out loud editing and seeing if that might illuminate some of the scenes that like definitely need to be in the book, and also illuminate some of the scenes that might be dragging, and the book would be functioning at a more optimal level if they hit the cutting room floor.
Anyone else? We're winding down to the wind down.
Who's writing a memoir? Just raise a hand. Okay, we've got a couple memoirs. So what are you curious about? Ask the nerdiest things you can.
When I'm trying to write something that is sort of nonfiction, I find myself often getting weirder than I should be. And then it ends up being clearly fiction. Recent short story I published, and people from my life who read it clearly recognized this is kind of based on my life in a certain time period. But anybody else that read it would have no idea that's true because it has sort of science fiction elements in it. Is this something you've struggled with? Do I just come to terms with the fact that I can't write memoir because my imagination goes too wild?
Every writer is going to be thinking about like verisimilitudes over here and pure fictions over here. Where do I want this particular story or this particular vignette to fall on that spectrum of truth? My third novel is called Damascus, and it came out 10 years ago. So if I ruin the ending, it's your fault, not mine. It ends with this woman dressing her estranged husband's dead body. That's something that happened to me when my father died. He was in hospice care at home, and he passed. I was there with my ex-wife, my two sisters, and my stepmom. And the hospice nurse was like, some people, as a way to say goodbye, like to dress the dead bodies. And we were like, that seems weird, but like, why not? And so together we all dressed him up. And it made such a pivotal impression on me. I was in my early 20s at the time, and I tried to write about it for years and I couldn't get it right. So I started to edit people out. Like I got rid of my ex-wife. She was the easiest one to get rid of. Then I got rid of the one sister I don't like as much as the other sister first. And then I got rid of the other sister. And what I ended up realizing was I was the one messing the moment up. It wasn't a story about a son. It was a story between spouses. So I took what happened to me, but I gave it to this fictional character, Sally. And when she was by herself, that was when it came to life because it was insurmountable. It was impossible to dress this passive weight. And suddenly it became this interesting superimposition on grief. So it's something that happened to me, but I fictionalized it in such a way that unless you were like a good friend of mine, you would not be able to recognize that. In Memoir Town, it was more a matter of when I was in the hospital after stroke 4, the doctors stand by the surgery, and they said, a cardiologist looked me right in the eyes and said, you are not going to live out of your 40s. Well, what am I supposed to do with that information? And it became like such a personal thing. My daughter's so young. I wanted to write this love letter to her. And then you think about Model Citizen, the first thing you would say to me is like, Josh, do you actually know what a love letter is? Because I don't think they're supposed to have so many felonies in them. But I would argue that that's what makes it a real love letter, is that I'm not airbrushing the truth. I'm not varnishing it. I'm going to give her unfettered access to who I was during my short time here. And so that became the truth, whatever that word means, was a key component of what I wanted to do. So in a sense, it's more a matter of what do you want to empower? Do you want to empower this story that needs to be tethered to your specific set of perceptions? Or is this vignette or this image that you're constructing on the page, would it mean more tethered to a different set of perceptions, a different decision-making mechanism, a different logic system, a different moral center? So I think more a matter of thinking about the plot, I would turn it around and say, which character, me or somebody else, is going to do more with this? How is it going to hit harder for the audience? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I just had a similar problem too, because I took my daughter to 7-Eleven about a month ago, and this guy pulled a knife on us in the parking lot. It was a very weird moment. I knew I wanted to write about it, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. So what happened was he was here, and I was here. And my daughter was standing right next to me, and he flashed this knife on us, and all of a sudden my hands were around his neck, and I was choking him. And my daughter was watching the whole thing. I knew this wasn't good parenting, Val. I want you to know that I knew that wasn't good parenting, but I didn't know how to take my hands off him. He had a weapon so close to my kid. So the whole story takes place with my hands around his throat, and it had to be my hands. It wouldn't have worked with somebody else's hands. So that's why I think if you can tether plot to the right surrogate, that will help you, because it's more of a POV or characterization decision than it is actually like what the sequence of events or what the plot might end up being in the story. I have a couple old students here, and I teach this stuff. I call it characterization. Because at first, when we're just wrapping our head around storytelling, it's helpful to think about them as sovereign buckets. This is a plot push. This is a character reveal. But as our understanding of story gets more elegant, we want to fuse those things together so they become one thing that we're able to do with that element of simultaneity. It isn't plot and it isn't character. It's character. I mean, Craig does this clinic in The Contortionist Handbook. If it wasn't coming from that one person's mind, it would all fall apart. The best novels wouldn't work if you were able to change the main character. If we took Elizabeth Gilbert out of Eat, Pray, Love and we put her in Clockwork Orange, don't you think Clockwork Orange would sound just a little bit different?
The dog theory. Is there any character at any scene? If you made that character a dog, would it matter to the scene? And if it wouldn't matter, then that character is not doing anything that has repercussions.
The question that I ask myself on a scene-by-scene basis at this stage of my career, I just ask myself, what am I giving my audience to worry about right now? In this scene, what are they worried about? Books are about the drama of the human heart. Books are about inhabiting a consciousness that is not your own, looking through somebody else's system of life experiences, and hopefully that teaches us a little bit about empathy.
Josh, if I can just cycle back to something you talked about in the beginning, specifically addiction, I wanted to pick your brain. Are you familiar with Gabor Mate?
Say the name again?
Gabor Mate.
Who's that?
Oh,
In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, is that the book, Sebastian? In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts?
Yeah. If you haven't read it or listened, he's got tons of YouTube lectures. That was brought to my mind when you were talking about when people ask, about addiction. He says that's the wrong question because we all know the benefits, right?
Right.
Pain relief, right? Because all substances relieve pain in some way or another. So really the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And for him, he traces it all back to childhood trauma.
As a memoirist, too, I think, in order to understand the version that's on the page in the present action, we have to then interrogate certain previous iterations to come back to that phrase, the dignity of complexity. Like, we all know that we want complicated or complex characters. We hear this in writing workshops all the time. And then we would nod along and say, oh, yes, complex characters indeed. And then you get home and the cursor's flashing in your face and you're like, how the hell do I do that? Like, typically what complexity means is that you have the brazenness or the bravery to show them from a multitude of angles. Like, you see me as a teacher. You see me as a father. You see me as a husband. You see me as an addict. You see me in all these various walks of life. And then you then combine those things, and that gives you kind of a comprehensive understanding about who I am as a person in the present. But you wouldn't be able to see that without having access to some of this stuff that happened as you're coming of age. So we definitely want to honor those things. Certainly. Are you writing a memoir yourself?
No, I don't write memoirs, but I will echo with somebody else. I forget. I think it was Val. And like all my pieces, I guess, are kind of memoir-ish in that I'm exploring some deep, unresolved, dark part of me that I haven't. So there's a deep part of me that I don't want to deal with that I bring, and to try to make the, I don't know how graphic I can get. I don't want to get too graphic, but like, right. For like a sexual abuse thing, for one of the pieces, I had the guy do a horrific thing to a pedophile, right? That's kind of resolving the story of me, right? So, it's still fiction, but it's a way for me to resolve the internal story that was unresolved that happened to me. So I guess that's memoir-ish, right? But it's not, but it's told through the fiction, through the medium of fiction.
I think too is all storytellers have like kind of a small stable of preoccupations that like we're all revisiting. David Lynch has made the same movie 7 times. I just like the movie, so I'll keep seeing it. Like how many times did the Rolling Stones write the same song? It's a good song. If we only get one good idea, we might as well explore it as much as we possibly can. With memoir, the scary thing is, when reviews start to come out, like, are they talking about the book or are they talking about you? Yeah. Like when I have a novel come out, I'll read the reviews. But when I have a memoir come out, I don't read anything. When the New York Times review came out on Tuesday, I didn't read it. When the Chronicle or the LA Times came out later in the week, I didn't read those things. This is going to hurt my feelings. Even if they're nice, it's going to hurt my feelings. Like, it's not mine anymore. I think that a book, a memoir especially, is in suspended animation until a reader is generous enough to bring it to life with her imagination and her heart. Like, without the audience, I have nothing. I remember reading an apocryphal, probably, story about Fred Astaire, who was asked what it was like to be the best dancer in the world. And Fred Astaire said, "How the hell do I know? Ask Ginger Rogers. She does the same thing backwards and wearing heels." And I think that's a really good analog for what we do with the reader. Like in the analogy, we then, as the writers, would be Fred Astaire. And we have to be confident that the audience is really good at her job. Otherwise, we're going to spoon feed, or we're going to over-explicate, or we're going to pander or pull a punch. People say never think about readers. I don't agree with that. I think you should think about readers, but I think you should think about your target audience. So, for example, this book came out on Tuesday, yeah? And I know definitively that the first person to buy a copy was Virginia Woolf. That she crawled from the grave to like the nearest independent bookstore and she bought it. And then Sam Shepard bought one. And then Tom Waits, and then Patti Smith. And if I think about my people, I think about my heroes that are such good readers, I don't ever have to worry if they're good at their job. They're all little Ginger Rogers. So I think a part about, being comfortable with our own storytelling abilities is also being confident in the readerly abilities of our audience. We have to write as though our audience members are brilliant. I know that can be a difficult thing to do because we want, like, if we do something cool on the page, we want to make sure they get it. Did you see that? Did you see that cool thing I did? But we have to resist that stuff. We have to risk losing the crappy readers to keep the smart ones. If you take nothing else from this hour together, I really hope that you take that one with you. Write as though your audience is brilliant because they are.
You beat me to it, Josh. At the end of every session, I always ask for one last bit of mic drop wisdom. But write as though your audience is smarter than you. Is that yours? If you got another one, let's do it.
I have a tattoo from Pablo Picasso that just says, the chief enemy of creativity is good taste. I think it's really important for us as storytellers to never chase the idiosyncrasies of an era. I think it's really important for you to honor your work in a timeless way. I mentioned earlier that you have this vital, vibrant organ. I really, truly believe that your imagination is a vital organ. If we don't use it, we won't live in a homeostasis way. In order to do that, tell the story that only you can tell. Think about the great constellation of storytellers, right? Here's Toni Morrison's hanging out over here, and here's Dennis Johnson's over here, and here's Baldwin, and here's Didion. They figured out what their version of the compelling story is. This is an exercise that I think you should not do. If you don't do it today, do it this week. Sit down for 5 minutes with a cup of coffee and write down what you think the word compelling means. And then sit down and write what you think the word story means. The conversation happening between that adjective and that noun, that is your style. That is what you're trying to get good at. Because I know a lot of writers who don't really even know what they're trying to get good at. They just say I want to be a good writer. Well, what does that mean? Try to be more precise. And if you can figure out the modifier compelling and the noun story, when I do this with grad students, I make them read it out loud. What's really cool, Craig, is the various definitions of the word story. Forget the adjective, right? Those are always Rorschach tests. But the noun itself, it's fascinating to see how people are going to empower that word in various ways. But it'd be something to do this week, as you're thinking about your own style or how you want to disseminate content to your audience. Like I talked about the bad brains earlier, like that works for me. Half of you don't even know who Bad Brains is, and that's totally fine. But you want to figure out what your definition of the compelling story is going to be, figure out what you're trying to get good at, and then, be the most prolific reader and be the most prolific practicer on the page that you possibly can be. There's always this autodidact component of learning how to write a book. You can read a bunch of craft shit, you can take classes and whatnot, but until you've been in the wild at page 290, knowing what a good book looks like, but knowing you have not written it yet, like that's when we start to get our black belt. Like really feel like zeroing in on what it's like for you as a storyteller. Your version of compelling, your version of story. Put those things together, and that's who you are as an auteur.
Mick, are you there? You want to try to sneak one last one in after the mic drop? We'll make an exception this time.
Hey, Josh. My question is, I am writing a memoir. I'm writing a coming-of-age memoir, and my parents weren't part of a satanic cult. I don't have like a major addiction story. We kind of joke about it. The memoir business right now seems to be kind of like misery porn. You have to have some hugely big traumatic event, because we've been reading memoir now for a couple decades, really digesting it. And what was fresh 20 years ago is not quite fresh today. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. I know you've been speaking to that all sort of around the issue, but how to sometimes tell the more ordinary stories that still haunt us without the big, the big bang or the big mic drop moment.
It's a great question. And I think, the hardest thing to learn how to write in an interesting way is happiness. Happiness shouldn't be inherently boring, but it can be inherently boring if we allow it to be. I think what I would do, Mick, is I would come back to that question I was saying earlier that I asked myself rhetorically around, what am I giving my audience to worry about right now? So like, even if you're talking about a happy memory, if it's about family, there's always subtext. Family means subtext. Grace Paley used to say, I know I've written one story when I've written two stories, meaning that I've equally doted on the literal action as I have on the subtextual action. So even if what's happening literally is something like you're talking about that's more kind of like bucolic or happy or humdrum, really analyze the story under the story. Because I think there's always stuff that we can infuse, especially when we're talking about, family and the dissonance and the friction of kind of maintaining that milieu. That might be a question that would bring up some fertile territory for you.
One thing I like to point out very quickly when it comes to your question, Mick, is conflict does not mean necessarily combat or confrontation. Conflict is simply resistance. It can mean combat or confrontation, but Buster Keaton's entire career is basically man versus machine, right? So resistance that makes for a story, some obstacle or force in a protagonist's way doesn't necessarily mean gloom and doom.
Did you ever get sick of your own story in the process of writing memoir?
Oh, God, of course. That's why I'm always writing two books at the same time. Just trying to have I have a memoir and I have a novel going. I usually have some shorter stuff too. I sold a television show last year, so I'm always working on in a script world too, which is nice to kind of flex some different muscles. The hot potato model is great because if I get frustrated talking about myself, I'll hop over to the novel for a little bit, or I'll go work on a script. The memoir stuff is really personal to me because I make so much art, like my ass is on fire, because just in case my cardiologist is right, I want to make as many pieces of art as I possibly can before I ain't around here anymore. So I just wake up every day feeling like I'm in bonus land. Like I probably shouldn't have survived stroke 4, and I did, and I have very little legacies of it. I'm like the luckiest unlucky person you've ever met. And it makes me profoundly happy that I'm still here and I get to be a dad today. I was just playing soccer with my kid 10 minutes before this started. And then I get to nerd out with all of you, and then I'm going to go write. Is this the perfect day ever? It is. And so was yesterday. And so was the day before. So, we live in a society that even allows us such a bourgeois pursuit. We could be digging ditches right now in sub-Saharan Africa, but we get to do this. How lucky are we? we're a dying breed, and we're all in this together. I think community is such an underestimated component of what we do. So what you're doing, the service you're doing here, Craig, it's God's work, and thank you for doing it.
And that's really it, y'all. Thank you very, very much for coming, Josh. Go play with your daughter, okay?
Keep practicing, and I can't wait to buy your books in a few years.
Cheers.